Hey, so I am on the road, but we are going to keep this thing moving. We are in Exodus chapter 8. This is the second book of the Bible, eighth chapter. We are going to cover the entire chapter. It is verses 1 through 32. And we are picking up where we left off in Exodus chapter 7, which is the first plague. So the first plague was turning the water into blood. Okay, so we start off where God is telling Moses, go back to Pharaoh. Go back to Pharaoh and tell him what I said and say, I said it. So he says, so God tells Moses to go to Pharaoh and say, thus says the Lord. The Lord told me to tell you, these are the words of God, not my words. And it says, let my people go so that they may worship me. We like to remember the let my people go part, but we forget the so that they may worship me. And if you refuse to let them go, I'll plague your whole country with frogs. So this is the introduction of the second plague, the frogs. And so it continues on to say what all is going to happen. Again, the first plague where it went from blood, where the water was turned into blood, it talked about the fish dying and the land stinking. And this one, it is coming with additional steps as well, that frogs are going to plague the country. It's going to cover everything. These frogs are going to be everywhere. They're going to be in your palaces. They're going to be in your bed, your bedroom, and your bed. They're going to be in the houses of your officials and all the people. They're going to be in the ovens. They're going to be in the kitchen. They're going to be touching the food. It's going to be frogs everywhere. And they're going to literally be so many frogs. They're going to be on you. And so God tells Moses to tell Aaron what to do. So all this whole Moses being a mouthpiece thing and not knowing how to talk and all that stuff, God is giving him instructions and saying, tell the people what I told you to tell them. And when you tell them, have Aaron do the thing. So Aaron is supposed to stretch out his hand, holding that staff over the rivers and canals and the pools, and frogs are going to come up from there. So it's not this time he stretches his hand out. It's going to be over all the water, but it's to affect frogs coming out. And so Aaron does it because Pharaoh was like, nah, that ain't none of my business. We got work to do. And so Aaron does it and frogs come out and they cover the land of Egypt, like cover the land. And so in verse 7, it says that the magicians did the same by their secret arts, the magicians of Egypt. So at every turn, this is the third time that the magicians have been called upon to kind of simulate or to duplicate what God is doing in this land. And it is a way for Pharaoh to say, oh, it's your God's not special. He's not doing something that we can't do. Mind you, they've never been able to undo a thing, but they've been able to duplicate it. And it has given him some confidence in the fact that, God is not unique in this situation. So in verse 7, it says that the magicians came and brought up more frogs. Now, if you have too many frogs and they are in your homes and in your rooms, in your kitchen, in the oven, they are in the bowls of food. You trying to let your bread rise and this frog's hopping on it. Like it's overwhelming the land. They're everywhere. And you bring somebody to make more frogs. Like, it seems like what you should have been asking them to do is get rid of the ones that are already there. But that's not what happened. So first, the magicians were able to duplicate the blood, water into blood. Secondly, they were able to duplicate, first it was the staff turning into snakes. They were able to duplicate that. Second was the water into blood. And now third, they were able to duplicate the frogs. 3 things they were able to duplicate. God said that's enough. Okay, so at the end of all these frogs, so they are able in verse 7 to duplicate it. So in verse 8, Pharaoh says, Moses and Aaron, pray to the Lord. Pray to the Lord. Now at this point, he's like, okay, maybe there's something here that I don't have. Maybe there's something here that we can't duplicate. And he said, pray to him to take the frogs away, and I will let the people go sacrifice. He said, okay, if you pray and tell your God to take these, tell the Lord, not your God, tell the Lord to take these frogs away. Then I'll go ahead and let those people go sacrifice. He is saying, I'm going to do the thing that you're asking for. And so Moses said, Pharaoh, tell me when I should do this. And like when it should be done and when I do it, the frogs are going to go back to being regular frogs in the water where they belong. They're not going to be in houses and all over the land. They're going to be regular frogs when they're done. And so he said, well, when do you want this to happen? And Pharaoh was like, tomorrow, like, let's get this. Let's do it. Let's do it. No time to waste. Let's get it done. First thing. And so Moses is like, cool. Now, I want you to know that there is no one like our God. There is no one like the God that I serve, the Lord our God. He's saying, look, I know you don't believe that this is a God above you. I know that you don't believe, you weren't raised, you weren't taught, you don't know the things that I know about this, about God, but this is a God for us. And he says, look, what's going to happen is I'm going to pray and that he's going to remove the frogs and they're only going to be left where they're supposed to be. And so they leave and they go do that. Moses goes and prays and asks God to pull the frogs back. And God responds. The frogs die. He said, can you get rid of the frogs? And he did. All the frogs died. These are extra frogs God created specifically for this plague. And so they all died. But they died where they were, in the houses, in the courtyards, in the fields, all over the place, like everywhere they were. And so people are gathering all these dead frogs together and they're putting in these huge piles. And of course, these frogs are decomposing in the desert sun. They stink. And I mean, they were frogs to begin with, so I'm pretty certain they weren't smelling like, fresh cut flowers. But it became a thing. So now we have these great towers of stinky dead frogs everywhere. And Pharaoh was like, nah, the frogs are gone. I ain't got no problems. Let's get it back to work. And so he withdraws his agreement. Like he reneges on the agreement and says, I'm absolutely not going to do that. And his heart was hardened just the way that God had already told Moses to expect. He told him that was going to happen. So then God says to Moses, tell Aaron to stretch out the staff and strike the dust on the earth. And it's going to become gnats. Some versions say lice. Some versions say various different little bugs that bother you, things that crawl on your skin, small kind of microscopic things. Because remember, this is dust that's turning into something. And gnats, you can walk through a cloud of gnats when you're out and it'll be like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these tiny bugs into little space. Lice are also very, very small, not something that you see or, we would not be out here or just, living life. Like you have to be looking for them to see them because they're very small. And so either way, what it is there is a pest and a pestilence that is all over everything. And it says that in verse 17, that Aaron did what God told him to do. He struck the dust of the earth and gnats flew up. So if you can imagine, when you go and you beat a rug and all the dust comes out of it, that's what happened. He hit the ground and the dust that rose into these kind of pest-like insects, and they took over. They are on the animals and the humans are all in everybody's hair and skin, and it's just a huge pest. And so in verse 18, the magicians tried to do the same thing, but couldn't. Now, there's gnats or lice or whatever it is that are all over every man and animal. And lice may be a good way of looking at this because it is specifically on humans and animals. And so we know lice live in hair. Like the scalp along the hair or the skin underneath hair is where they typically reside. So we can understand how that attaches. But the magicians tried it and they failed. So the first three things they were able to duplicate, and God said, not no more. We're not playing games with you anymore. You thought you were on a level with me. You kept trying to convince him that you were on a level with me and that he was capable of commanding the same things I can command, but no more. No more. We played your game and your game is done. You're done. So God went ahead and shut it down. So they're not able to duplicate it. And so in verse 19, it says, the magicians say to Pharaoh, this is the finger of God. And it says Pharaoh's heart was hardened and he still wouldn't listen, just like God said. But what I want us to understand is here, Pharaoh's heart is hard because Pharaoh was hard-headed, because he was already all of these things. He already had this belief and understanding of himself as a God, so he could contend with God in his own mind. And when God is saying this is what's going to happen, this is the way he's going to do it, it's because God knows him. God knows how he's going to respond. He knows what he's going to do. And he gave Moses some insight into that by saying, oh, Pharaoh's going to harden his heart. Not that God is specifically making this man behave this way. This is how he wanted to behave. And God is allowing it and gave Moses the understanding that this is how it's going to play out. And so even with his magicians telling him and letting him know that this is the hand of God. God is doing this. This is bigger than us. We can't duplicate it no more. I can't play this game with you no more. I'm out. And so in verse 20, God says to Moses, go real early in the morning and go to Pharaoh just as he's getting out of the water. This is, catching while he's hopping out the shower, getting while he's in the middle of his morning routine, getting everything together. I want you to go and I want you to say again, the Lord has said, let my people go so that they can worship. And if you don't, I'm going to send flies this time. And these flies are a huge pest. This is not, oh, it's a fly on my burger. Oh, it's, a ruining the cookout. But these are like biting flies. These are flies that affect people. This isn't just a nuisance. This is another pest that affects their physical space, physical bodies. And so in verse 21, when God is saying, look, I'm going to send swarms of flies. They're going to be on you, your officials, your people, in the houses of the Egyptians, and everywhere. They're gonna so cover the land. But in verse 22, it says, but on that day, I'm going to set apart the land of Goshen. So from this point forward, every one of these plagues have been affecting everybody. Frogs affected everybody. The water being turned into blood affected everybody. The gnats affected, or lice affected everybody. But at this point, God said, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to let this be just for you guys. I'm not going to suffer my people with you anymore. I'm going to make a distinction between your people and mine. I'm going to make a distinction between the lands. So Goshen is going to be set apart. And Goshen, of course, is the land that Jacob, or Israel, moved into with his original family when there were still 70 members coming into Egypt many, many, many years ago during the famine. And so they have grown in this land and grown in this land and grown in this land. So as the plagues are hitting from this point forward, only Egypt is affected. The land of Goshen, where the Israelites live, is not affected by this. And so it says in verse 22 that no swarms of flies shall be there. God said, I ain't going to keep punishing my people with you. I gave you the benefit of the doubt. I gave you an opportunity to turn. You wanted to be hard-headed? Let's be hard-headed. And so in verse 23, it says, I'm going to make a distinction between my people and yours. And this is going to happen tomorrow. So God has sent this message through Moses to Pharaoh. And Pharaoh was like, this dude. And so God went ahead and let it go. And he let great swarms of flies come into the house of Pharaoh and the officials. Like he started at the head and worked his way down. So it went to Pharaoh first. The plagues hit him first. Every time the plagues hit him first. He saw it first. He felt it first. It affected him first. And that's why, and then it spread throughout Egypt. And so in verse 25, Pharaoh is like, hey, get Moses and Aaron in here. Tell them to go sacrifice to their God within the land. You all can go worship your God. I'm not going to do the let my people go part. But you can worship your God. Do it here. He's trying to bargain at this point and do it here. You don't get to go. You got to do it here. And so Moses is like, look, we can't do that. The sacrifice that we offer is offensive to you. It's an abomination to you. It's something that you and your people have laws and rules against. It's a thing that y'all don't like and don't want to see. So if we do it, in the face of the Egyptians, y'all gonna stone us. And we're not creating those problems. Like, this ain't what God asked for. It goes against your rules. It goes against God's rules. And we're not even going to attempt like this is a good compromise. What he doesn't do is immediately settle. He said, for God I stand and for God I die. Like, this is not going down. And that's one of those things we have to understand. Sometimes we feel like any piece of a thing is okay. And we're not. God is not giving us pieces of people. He's not giving us pieces of love, pieces of opportunity. I mean, I got this job, so I'm gonna be happy with this job. And that's just what it is. Yes, but God has a career. God has a purpose and meaning to you and your life. And it's just not a let me just have what I can have. This whole a piece of a man is better than no man at all. That's crazy, friends. That is never what God had for you. You don't have to have a little bit of what God said. You just got to hold on to the promise and know that God is going to come through fully in the way that he said. And so in verse 27, he points out we got to go 3 days. It's a 3-day journey God called for. It's a 3-day journey that we need to have. And so Pharaoh was like, cool, I'll let you go, but just don't go too far away. Like, don't leave. Like, don't, just pray. Just pray and make it go away. And I'll let you go and sacrifice in the wilderness, but you don't need to go that far away. And so Moses said, as soon as I leave, I'm going to pray that the swarms of flies will depart. But don't be dishonest with me again. Don't say you're gonna let us go and then don't let us go. Don't say you're gonna let us worship and then don't let us worship, or try and put conditions on it. So Moses was a man of his word and went out and did what God told him, went out and did what Pharaoh asked him to do, and he prayed to God. And God did what Moses asked. He removed all the flies, and it was so that not even one remained. He took the entire pestilence out of the land. I don't know what was there before. I don't know if it was fly season. I don't know if it wasn't fly season. I don't know what was going on, but he took it all out. So there were none left. And as soon as it happened, Pharaoh hardened his heart and would not let the people go. Okay, so that is the end of that chapter. I'm gonna do a quick recap. And so the recap is, it starts off with Moses being sent to Pharaoh and telling him to let the people go so that they may worship. Do not leave that part off. The point of them leaving, the thing that God asked for, was so that they could go 3 days into the wilderness and worship. This was never a time or a place where they could just let my people go, free all the slaves. That was never the request here. The request was that my people go so they can worship me. The whole point in freedom, the whole point in the freedom was so that you could be free to worship the God who freed you, that you would be free to worship. That is what it is. Let my people go so that they can worship me. Let them be free to worship. And now there's a thing, this freedom gives you something to worship God for. It gives you a thing to be grateful for, to understand that this is a God who freed you from something you couldn't free yourself from chains and bondage that you didn't even really know you had. And so I want to caution us in understanding that our salvation is freedom from the entanglements, from the foolishness that our past was, that our lives were, the belief systems that we had that had us kind of spinning in circles. There was freedom from that. And the freedom from it is so that we can worship. Worship is what we're designed to do. Okay? So that is where we started off at. And that's what we're going with. And so the plagues will continue basically. And so God says, hey, I'm going to send frogs, and these frogs going to be everywhere and in everything. And so Pharaoh was like, whatever, man, let's do it. And so God sends frogs, and Aaron carries out the instructions to make the frogs come, and the frogs get in everything everywhere. And so Pharaoh was like, well, I guess we're going to let him go. So we're going to go ahead and let him go, but you take the frogs away and I'll let the people go sacrifice. And so Moses went, prayed, frogs left, and Pharaoh was like, nah, second thought, I don't think I'm going to do that. And so Moses and Aaron went back, and God was like, look, hit the ground. When the dust comes up, it's going to come up like gnats or lice. And these bugs are going to be absolutely everywhere on everything. And so Aaron follows the instructions. He was obedient to God. The gnats came up, covered everything in dust, and it was a mess. And Pharaoh again said, hey, go ahead out. I want you to get rid of this. Now, the first plague was when the first sign that the magicians of Egypt were able to duplicate was the snakes being, the rods being thrown on the ground and turning into snakes. They could duplicate that. When the water in the Nile turned to blood, they could duplicate that. When the frogs came, they could duplicate that. They couldn't get rid of frogs, but they could make more. And so at this point, God was like, nah, y'all can't make no more stuff. So when the gnats or the lice come, those bugs come up and they're like dust in the air and they're all over the place and they're covering everybody and they're small and those in your mouth bugs, they couldn't duplicate it. And the magicians at that point said, this is God. We're out. We can't battle this. This is God. Even the enemy recognizes the power of God. You should too. And so they couldn't duplicate it and they couldn't get rid of it. So what they decided to do was back. And so Pharaoh said, all right, call Moses in. Actually, he didn't call Moses in. God told Moses to go early when Pharaoh is just getting out the water and say, hey, I'm going to send these swarms of flies that are going to come. And these flies are going to come and they're going to irritate you first. They're going to go head down. But from this point forward, I'm going to separate your people from my people. And so Goshen won't be affected. The Israelites won't be affected by these plagues as long as they are in position. As long as where they're supposed to be, they're not going to be affected by this. You and your people will. Because now it's a battle. Since you want to battle with me and see if you're a God like me, let me remind you of how human you are. And so that is exactly what happens. He continues to kind of buck against God and was like, all right, so we're going to let the people worship, but they can't leave. And he's like bargaining with Moses on how this is going to happen. And Moses is like, that's not even what's going to happen. You're going to let them go and worship. And so finally, Pharaoh agrees. And when Pharaoh agrees, Moses goes and prays and God removes the flies so that there's not even one left. So at this point, it's not a pile of dead flies. It's not like the way things have been piling up before, that God actually removes them. And when he does, he's showing that nature obeys me. I don't have to obey the rules of nature. And so I can make the flies leave the same way I made them come. They don't have to like die here. Now you got to deal with all of that. I can get rid of even that for you. And so what happens is he hardens his heart again. His heart is hard. And he says, nah, I'm not going to do it. Now that everything's cleared up, now that we ain't got no problems, we good, everything is good, I'm out. I don't have to do that anymore. And so he at the close of this chapter, he decided he wouldn't let the people go to worship. And he had bargained and kind of haggled a little bit trying to get what he wanted, but he still ended up not coming through on the deal. So what I want us to remember is, 1, we became free to worship. Do not forget to worship. 2, it is not required for you to take less than the full portion that God has promised you. It is not required of you to be less than who God called you to be because there's just not enough space. You don't have to bargain or you don't have to come to a compromise on the promises of God. You get the full thing. You just got to be patient enough to wait for it. And when the deal isn't right, let it go. You don't have to pay 21% interest on this car. You don't have to have a townhouse instead of a single family home if that's what the promise of God is. Don't haggle, don't compromise, don't fall, don't decide that this isn't something that you're going to have because you're able to have it. So what I want you guys to do is keep that in mind and be careful about when you are setting your heart hard against things. Pray and ask God to make sure that you are soft in the ways you're supposed to be and that you're not bucking against him. All right? Y'all be blessed.